The year 1872 had baked the borderlands between the Arizona and New Mexico territories into a crust of red dust and brittle faith. In the heart of this desolation lay Dust Creek, a town that clung to life like a stubborn cactus. It was a place held together not by laws, but by the unspoken agreements of men who survived on whiskey, gunpowder, and the weight of their word. Here, honor was a currency more stable than gold, and survival was a daily sacrament. Elena Moore, at 19 years, knew the language of this land. It was in the rhythmic clang of her father's hammer against steel, a sound that had been the metronome of her life since her mother had passed. She was a blacksmith's daughter, with calluses on her palms that belied the softness in her gray eyes. Those eyes now were fixed on the shimmering heat rising from the anvil. Her thoughts a world away from the horseshoe taking shape under her father's practiced blows. She dreamed of a life beyond the dust, a place with enough water for green things to grow, a place where a woman's worth wasn't measured by the man she married. Jedediah Moore set his hammer down, the sudden silence deafening. He was a widower, a man whose grief had settled into the lines on his face, carving canyons of worry around his mouth and eyes. He wiped a sweat-streaked arm across his brow, his gaze finding his daughter's. There was a heaviness in his look that Elena had learned to dread. It was the look he wore when the world was pressing in, when a hard choice had to be made. "Elena," he began, his voice raspy from the coal smoke. "Come inside. We need to talk." The air in their small home behind the smithy was thick with the scent of boiled coffee and old sorrow. Elena sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands folded in her lap, a posture of forced calm. Her father didn't sit, he paced, a caged bear in the small room, his shadow dancing on the plank walls. "Dr. Miller was here this morning," Jedediah said, stopping to stare out the single grimy window. No change. Elena's heart gave a small, tight squeeze. They both knew who he meant. Cale Blackhawk. The name was a legend in Dust Creek, a whisper of both salvation and fear. A man of two worlds, half Apache and half white. He was a warrior who had, a year prior, ridden into a raid and saved a dozen townsfolk from being slaughtered. He had been a bridge, a promise of peace. Now, he was a body lying still in a bed at the edge of the Apache camp, lost in a deep, unwaking sleep for 3 months since a retaliatory ambush left him for dead. "His people are growing restless," her father continued, turning from the window. The desperation in his eyes was a physical blow. "They see his stillness as a bad omen. The hotheads among them say the white man's spirit has cursed him. The treaty we made, the peace we've had, it's all fraying like an old rope." Elena said nothing. She knew this was not just a town update. It was the preamble to a sacrifice, and she had a sickening feeling she was the intended offering. "The chief, his uncle, he made an offer," Jedediah said, his words coming out in a rush, "a way to bind us together again, a permanent bond, to show our faith, to show that we honor the man who saved us." He finally sat, his large, calloused hands reaching across the table. He did not take hers, but laid a small object on the wood between them. It was a ring, a simple band of hammered copper. It was dull, already showing the faint green kiss of tarnish, unadorned and heavy. It looked less like a piece of jewelry and more like a shackle. "They want a marriage," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They want you to become his wife." The words hung in the air, obscene and impossible. Elena stared at him, then at the ring, a bitter laugh catching in her throat. "His wife, father, he is a ghost, a man who cannot wake. You want me to marry a corpse?" "He is not a corpse," Jedediah snapped, his own fear making him harsh. He breathes. His heart beats. He is a hero, Elena, and this is a debt of honor, my honor, the town's honor." "What about my honor?" she shot back, her voice trembling with a fury that was part fear, part outrage. "What about my life, to be a widow before I am a wife? To sit in a teepee and watch a man breathe until he stops. For how long? A week, a year, the rest of my days. You will be cared for, protected, he insisted, his certainty sounding hollow even to his own ears. You will be the wife of Cale Blackhawk. It's a position of respect. It is a cage, she whispered, pushing the ring back toward him. I will not do it. His face hardened, the lines of worry turning to granite. This is not about what you want, Elena. This is about what is necessary. It is your duty. As my daughter, as a woman of this town, this peace is all we have. Without it, we will be burying our own. The weight of his words, of the entire town's expectations, settled on her shoulders. The duty of a frontier woman. It was a lesson she had learned at her mother's knee. You did what was needed. You sacrificed. You endured. Her dreams of a green world, of a life she chose for herself, shriveled in the heat of his gaze. She was trapped, not just by her father's demand, but by the unwritten laws of this hard land. To refuse was to endanger everyone she knew, to brand her father a man without honor. Later that day, she walked through Dust Creek, seeing it with new eyes. It was no longer her home. It was her prison. The salutations from neighbors felt like the murmurs of executioners. She saw Mrs. Gable, whose son had been saved by Cale, nodding to her with a look of pity and gratitude that was somehow worse than condemnation. She heard the whispers from the saloon, men talking of the Apache and the fragile peace, their voices laced with an anxiety that confirmed her father's fears. She was being traded, a piece of property to settle a debt. The town that Cale Blackhawk had saved was now asking her to save them in return by sacrificing her future to his silent, sleeping form. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, her father approached her again. He did not speak of duty or honor this time. He just stood before her, his shoulders slumped, the formidable blacksmith looking like a broken old man. He held out the copper ring again. It lay in his palm, a tarnished circle of obligation. His people believe a spirit can be called back, Jedediah said softly. They believe he can hear, even in his sleep. They believe the bond of a wife might be a tether to this world, a voice to call him home. It was a fool's hope, a piece of tribal mysticism that no sane person would believe. And yet, it was the first thing he had said that chipped away at her resolve. Not the logic of it, but the desperation behind it. It was the plea of a man, of a whole community, staring into an abyss of violence and seeing only one, impossible, path to safety. Elena looked from her father's weary face to the ring. It was ugly and unyielding, a symbol of everything she did not want. But it was also strong, forged in fire, meant to last. A promise, however terrible. She thought of Cale Blackhawk, the man she had never met, whose name she only knew from stories of his bravery. He was trapped in his own prison of silence, a far more profound one than hers. A strange, cold thought entered her mind. The cold of the desert night was a familiar comfort, a sharp, clean clarity after the day's oppressive heat. But it was nothing compared to the cold she imagined in that teepee, in the suffocating stillness beside a husband whose voice she had never heard, whose eyes she had never seen open. That silence felt like a tangible thing, a void that could swallow a person whole, and she was being asked to walk right into it. Slowly, her hand rose, her fingers, strong and capable from years of helping in the smithy, closed around the heavy copper ring. She did not look at her father as she slipped it onto her finger. It felt cold against her skin, a brand of ownership. The choice had been made for her. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the sleeping warrior, to the tenuous peace of Dust Creek, to the wind and the endless red dust. The journey to the Apache camp was a silent one, marked only by the soft thud of horse hooves on packed earth and the whisper of the wind through sagebrush. Elena rode a borrowed mare, her few belongings tied in a bundle behind her. Her father had not come with her to the edge of town, Their farewell had been a stiff, wordless affair at the smithy, the air thick with unspoken grief and resentment. She was escorted by two of the chief's men, warriors, whose faces were impassive masks of weathered stone. They did not speak to her, and she did not speak to them. There was nothing to say. The copper ring on her finger felt heavier with every mile that separated her from everything she had ever known. As they crested a low mesa, the camp came into view. It was not the chaotic, savage place she had imagined from townsfolk's tales. It was a small, orderly village of hide lodges, nestled in a crook of the valley where a thin creek offered a ribbon of life-giving water. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, carrying the scent of roasting meat and herbs. But as she rode into the camp, a silence fell. The chatter of women ceased. The play of children froze. Every eye turned to her, and in their dark depths, she saw no welcome. She saw suspicion, curiosity, and a deep, pitying disdain. She was the white woman, the price of a fragile peace, the bride of the man who slept between worlds. She was the wife of the dead. An older woman with a face like a dried riverbed and eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 moons approached her. This was Singing Bird, Kale's aunt and the camp's healer. She took the mare's reins without a word and led Elena to a lodge set slightly apart from the others. It was larger, the hide painted with symbols of hawks and lightning. A small, tended fire smoldered near the entrance, its smoke curling straight into the cloudless sky. This was to be her home. This was his tomb. Singing Bird gestured for her to enter. Elena hesitated, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She took a breath, the air tasting of dust and smoke, and pushed aside the hide flap. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the smoke hole above and the faint glow of a few embers in a central fire pit. The air was thick with the scent of leather, sage, and something else. Something medicinal and faintly sweet. On a raised pallet of furs against the far wall lay a man, Kale Blackhawk. She had expected a hero to look larger, more formidable even in stillness, but he just looked like a man. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of a warrior, but his body had thinned during his long sleep. His skin was the color of sun-warmed copper, a legacy of his mixed blood. A thick braid of black hair lay across one shoulder. His face was a study in contrasts, the sharp line of his jaw and high cheekbone speaking of his Apache heritage, softened by a mouth that, even in repose, seemed capable of a gentle smile. But his eyes were closed. His face was a placid mask, revealing nothing of the spirit trapped within. Only the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest beneath a thin blanket gave any proof of life. Elena stood there for a long time, an intruder in this sacred silence. This was her husband, this stranger, this beautiful, broken man. Her duty was to sit in this dim light and wait for his breath to cease. The thought was so cold, so lonely. It felt like a physical pain. The first weeks were a blur of awkwardness and isolation. The other women of the tribe largely ignored her, speaking around her in their fluid, musical language as if she were a piece of furniture. They looked at her hands, softened by her life in town, and then at their own capable, calloused ones. And the judgment was clear. Singing Bird became her reluctant instructor, communicating through gestures and a few shared words of English and Spanish. She taught Elena how to grind corn into meal with a stone mano and metate, a back-breaking task that made her arms ache. She showed her how to scrape hides until they were supple, how to find the right herbs for tea, how to bank the fire so it would burn through the night. Elena was a clumsy student, but she was determined. Every small task she mastered was a victory against the crushing helplessness she felt. And as she worked, she began to see the world around her not as a prison, but simply as a different kind of home. She started to notice the stark beauty she had been blind to before. She saw the way the first light of dawn painted the mountains in shades of rose and gold. She learned the different calls of the hawks that circled high overhead. She felt the rhythm of the camp, a life lived in tune with the sun and the seasons. At night, she would sit outside the lodge, watching the central campfire. It was the heart of the community, a place of stories and laughter. The smoke that rose from its flames seemed to carry the tribe's spirit up to the vast, star-dusted sky. It was a symbol of life, of warmth, of belonging. Then she would look at the thin trail of smoke rising from her own lodge, and it felt like a fragile thread, a tether between the living world outside and the silent one within. Her days settled into a routine centered on Cale. She kept the lodge clean, the fire low and steady. She bathed his face and arms with a damp cloth. Singing Bird had shown her how to gently move his limbs, to keep them from stiffening, and she talked to him. At first, it was just a nervous, self-conscious trickle of words. She told him about her day, about the hawk she had seen, about the difficulty of grinding corn. It felt foolish, talking to a man who could not hear, but the silence in the lodge was a living thing, and her voice was the only weapon she had against it. One afternoon, as she held his hand while telling him a story about her father's smithy, she felt it, a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible contraction of his fingers against hers. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at his hand, waiting. Nothing. It must have been her imagination, a muscle spasm. She dismissed it, but a seed of something not quite hope, but a persistent, questioning curiosity had been planted. A few days later, it happened again. She was changing the cool compress on his forehead, her fingers brushing against his temple, his breathing, usually so shallow and even, hitched for a moment, deepening into a single, long sigh before returning to its quiet rhythm. This time, she knew she had not imagined it. There was someone in there. He was lost in the dark, but he was there. She began to watch him with a new intensity, searching for these small signs of life. She noticed how his breathing seemed to calm when she sang a quiet lullaby her mother had taught her. She saw the faint flutter of his eyelids when a log in the fire popped and hissed. These were motes of dust dancing in a sunbeam, glimpses of a presence she could feel but not grasp. He was no longer just a body she was tending. He was a mystery she was trying to solve. Her duty was transforming, shifting from a grim vigil into a strange, intimate partnership. The change in her was mirrored by a change in her dreams. The desert nights grew colder, and sleep became her only escape. But her dreams were no longer of green pastures or a life far away. They were of him in these dreams. Cale was not lying on a bed of furs. He was standing tall and strong, his eyes open and alert. They were dark, intelligent eyes that saw right through her. In the first dream, they stood on a high mesa overlooking the camp. He did not speak, but he turned and looked at her, and in his gaze, there was a profound recognition, a silent acknowledgement of her presence in his lodge. She woke with a gasp, the feeling of his eyes on her so real it lingered in the dim morning light. The dreams grew more vivid. They would walk together by the creek, the dream world version of him pointing out the tracks of a deer, his voice a low, pleasant rumble she had never heard in the waking world. One night, he led her to a cave behind a waterfall she did not know existed, the walls covered in ancient paintings. "This is the place of stories," he said, his English perfect, the place where the spirits speak. She woke up with her heart pounding, the sound of his voice echoing in her ears. Was she losing her mind? Was the loneliness and the grief of her lost life conjuring these fantasies? Then came the dream that changed everything. She found herself in a place of complete darkness, a suffocating, starless void. She was lost and terrified, calling out with no response. Then, a small light appeared in the distance, a single flame. As she moved toward it, she saw that it was a lantern, and Cale was holding it. He was not looking at her, but was looking out into the oppressive blackness, his expression calm and focused. The light from his lantern pushed back the shadows. "What are you doing?" she asked, her dream voice a whisper. He turned to her then, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a small, sad smile. "I am lost," he said, "but you are here. You are the keeper of the light." She awoke with tears on her cheeks. The dream had felt more real than her own life. It was a plea, a message from the depths of his long sleep. The line between her waking duty and her sleeping connection to him had dissolved. She no longer knew if she was a wife bound by honor or a woman bound by something far stranger, something that felt perilously close to faith. The smoke from their fire pit rose into the night, a silent prayer sent up from a world of shadows and whispers. Carrying a question she was too afraid to ask, was she here to watch him die, or to call him home? The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, offering little light to the world below. A different kind of light emanated from the center of the Apache camp. The entire tribe had gathered around a great bonfire, its flames leaping high, casting a frantic, dancing light on the solemn faces of the people. This was a night of ceremony. For months, Cale Blackhawk had slept, his spirit wandering in the Shadowlands. And tonight, the tribe would send its collective voice into that darkness to call him back. Elena sat just outside the entrance to his lodge, an observer on the fringe of this sacred circle. She was not invited to join, nor did she expect to be. She was the white woman, the wife of the sleeper, a symbol of a political pact, not a member of the family. From her vantage point, she could hear the rhythmic chant, a low, guttural prayer that rose and fell with the beat of a single, steady drum. The sound was hypnotic, weaving itself into the fabric of the night. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and sage, a sweet, cleansing smoke that was meant to purify the air and guide a lost spirit home. Inside the lodge, the only light came from their small, personal fire pit. The embers glowed a deep, pulsing red, casting a warm, intimate light on the man who lay on the furs. The sounds of the ceremony outside filtered through the hide walls, a muted heartbeat that filled the otherwise profound silence. For months, this silence had been her constant companion, a presence so heavy it felt like a third person in the small space. She had fought it with the sound of her own voice, with stories and songs, with whispered confessions to a man who could not hear. Or could he? Her dreams had become more insistent, more vivid. They were no longer just fleeting images, but entire conversations, shared moments that felt more real than her waking hours. The dream Cale had become a confidant, the keeper of her loneliness. He had called her the keeper of the light. The words echoed in her mind now, mocking and beautiful all at once. What light could she possibly hold in this place of shadows? She was a prisoner of duty, watching over a man suspended between life and death. Her own life held in the same unbearable suspension. A deep wave of loneliness washed over her, more powerful than any she had felt before. It was an ache that started deep in her chest and spread through her limbs, a coldness that the small fire could not touch. She looked at the faces in the firelight outside, a community bound by blood and belief, united in their purpose. They had each other. She had only this silence and the ghost who haunted her sleep. Her gaze fell upon Cale. The firelight played across the planes of his face, softening the sharp angles, making him look younger, more vulnerable. His chest rose and fell in its slow, metronomic rhythm. He was so still, so terribly, completely still. He was a ship becalmed in a windless sea, and she was a castaway on his silent deck. An impulse, sharp and undeniable, seized her. It was not born of logic or reason, but from the raw, aching core of her solitude. It was a feeling that transcended duty, a desperate need to make a connection, to offer a piece of her own warmth to the coldness of his long sleep. She rose from her seat by the entrance and knelt beside his pallet. The air in the lodge seemed to grow thick, heavy with the weight of the chanting outside and the unspoken prayer in her own heart. She reached out a tentative hand, her fingers hovering just above his forehead. His skin, usually cool to the touch, seemed to emanate a faint warmth, or perhaps it was just the heat of the fire. She thought of her dreams, of his voice, of the sad, Gentle smile he had given her in the darkness. He was not a symbol or a duty. He was a man, lost and alone, just as she was. Leaning forward, she closed her eyes and pressed her lips to his brow. It was not a wife's kiss. It was not born of passion or even affection. It was a kiss of profound and simple compassion, a quiet offering of solace from one lost soul to another, a single, human touch against the vast, indifferent silence. In that moment, she was not thinking of the town's honor or her father's fear. She was thinking only of the man who was the keeper of the light in her dreams, and her desperate, foolish hope that he might see it. As her lips left his skin, a sudden gust of wind billowed through the lodge. Though the hide flap was closed and the night outside was still, it swirled around the interior, stirring the embers in the fire pit. They erupted in a sudden, brilliant shower of sparks, the flames leaping up for a moment, bright and hot, illuminating the entire space in a flash of golden light. The shadows danced wildly on the walls and then settled back into place as the fire calmed. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She stared at Cale, her breath held tight in her chest. And then he moved. It began with his hand. The fingers that had lain limp and open for months twitched, then curled slowly into a loose fist. Then came a sound, a harsh, rasping noise that tore through the silence of the lodge. It was a breath, not the shallow, automatic breath of sleep, but a deep, shuddering gasp for air, as if a drowning man had just broken the surface. His whole body tensed. A tremor ran through him, a current of returning life, and then his eyelids, those still curtains that had remained drawn for so long, began to flutter. Elena scrambled back, a cry of shock and terror catching in her throat. Her mind reeled, unable to process what was happening. It was impossible. It was a miracle. It was a nightmare. The chants outside seemed to fade into a distant hum, the entire world narrowing to this single, unbelievable moment. Slowly, agonizingly, his eyes opened. They were not the clear, intelligent eyes of her dreams. They were clouded with confusion, unfocused, struggling to make sense of the light and shadow. They roamed the curved walls of the lodge before finally settling on her. He stared at her, his dark pupils contracting in the firelight. For a long moment, there was nothing. No recognition, no understanding, just the vacant gaze of a man pulled from a great and terrible depth. Elena trembled, her mind screaming at her to run, to flee from this impossible waking. Then his lips parted. A dry, cracked sound emerged, a voice unused for an eternity, a mere whisper of sound. "I heard your voice," he rasped, each word an immense effort. From the darkness, the words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was true, all of it, the dreams, the whispers, the feeling that he was listening. He had been there all along, lost in the shadows, and her voice had been a thread leading him out. The terror that had gripped her began to recede, replaced by a wave of awe so profound it left her dizzy. She looked into his eyes again, searching his face. The initial confusion was still there, but beneath it, something else was stirring. It was not a supernatural glow or a mystic power. It was something far more potent, something she recognized in the deepest part of her being. It was the fierce, desperate, and beautiful spark of a human soul fighting its way back to the light. It was the raw and undeniable will to live. In that moment, as she looked at the resurrected man before her, Elena realized that the kiss had not just been for him. The silence of his sleep had been her prison, her fear of a life without meaning her constant tormentor. In touching his life, in calling him back from the brink, she had inadvertently called to herself. He had been awakened from his body's sleep, and she had been awakened from the sleep of her own soul. They were two strangers, bound by a strange fate, and they had, together, just taken their first breath. The news of Cale Blackhawk's awakening ripped through the camp like a wildfire. The solemn chanting of the ceremony dissolved into a flurry of excited, disbelieving cries. People crowded around the entrance to his lodge, their faces a mixture of awe and fear, their voices a low hum of speculation. Singing Bird was the first to push her way inside, her ancient face a mask of stern control that did not quite hide the tremor in her hands. She saw Elena, pale and trembling, huddled on one side of the fire, and Cale, propped weakly on his elbows, blinking in the firelight like a man seeing the sun for the first time in a century. The days that followed were a strange dream, a disorienting blend of reverence and clinical reality. The tribe hailed Elena as a miracle worker, a woman with powerful medicine. They left offerings of dried meat and woven baskets at her lodge door. But their respect was laced with a new kind of distance. She was no longer just the white wife. She was a conduit to the spirit world, a figure of unsettling power. And this new status isolated her more than their previous scorn ever had. For Cale, the return to the world was not a triumphant charge, but a slow, painful crawl from a deep abyss. The long sleep had ravaged his body. The warrior who could once track a deer for 2 days and ride for a week without rest now struggled to lift a cup of broth to his own lips. His muscles, once thick ropes of power, were now slack and unresponsive. The weakness was a constant, humiliating companion, a betrayal by the very body that had defined him. But the physical struggle was nothing compared to the war being waged inside his mind. His memory was a shattered mirror, reflecting only fractured images. He could recall the heat of a battle, the face of an enemy, the feel of a bow in his hand. But he could not remember how he had come to be in this lodge. He knew the names of the stars in the Apache tongue, but the name of his own mother was a phantom that danced just beyond his grasp. The world felt thin, unreal, as if he were still dreaming. The one solid thing in his fractured consciousness, the one anchor in the swirling fog, was Elena. He did not remember her name. Not at first. He did not know she was his wife. He only knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that her voice was the one that had called him back from the endless dark. Her face was the first he had seen upon waking, and it had become the focal point of his new, bewildering existence. She was the constant presence in the lodge, her quiet movements a soothing rhythm, her scent of soap and wood smoke a comforting reality. Their first conversations were not of words. They were a language of the eyes, of gestures, of necessity. When he was thirsty, his gaze would drift to the water skin, and she would understand. When pain lanced through his atrophied limbs, a tightening around his mouth was all the signal she needed to fetch the herbal poultice from Singing Bird. Elena, in turn, learned to read the flicker of frustration in his eyes when his hand refused to obey his will, the shadow of despair that crossed his face when a memory eluded him. She was torn, the girl who had been forced into this marriage, who had dreamed only of escape, was gone. In her place was a woman who felt a fierce, protective bond with this broken man. Her feelings were a tangled knot of compassion, responsibility, and something warmer, something more terrifying that she refused to name. Was this love? Or was it just the profound connection forged between a rescuer and the rescued? The weight of the peace treaty, of two people's safety, rested on the fragile reality of their union. She was no longer just his wife by duty. She was his caretaker, his anchor, and the entire borderland was watching. The slow work of recovery began. Every day, Elena would help him sit up, his body trembling with the effort. They would walk, step by painful step, to the entrance of the lodge, his arm heavy across her shoulders, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Each small victory, sitting for a minute longer, taking one more step, was a monumental achievement celebrated in silence. As his body slowly mended, they began to build a bridge of words across the chasm that separated their worlds. His English was rusty, fragmented like his memories, but it was there, buried beneath months of silence. Her own knowledge of the Apache language was a handful of nouns for objects in the lodge, so they became each other's teachers. One afternoon, as she helped him drink a cup of cool water, he touched her hand, his fingers still weak, but his grip surprisingly firm. "Water," she said, pointing to the cup. He nodded, his gaze intense. "LT," he whispered, his voice still rough. It was the first word he had taught her. She repeated it, the sound foreign and beautiful on her tongue. A small smile touched his lips, and in that moment, the lodge felt less like a sick room and more like a classroom, a sanctuary. They continued this way, exchanging words like precious gifts. She taught him fire and ski and blanket. He taught her ta and sha and egal. Their conversations were a clumsy patchwork of two languages, filled with long pauses and frequent misunderstandings. But they were conversations nonetheless. They were learning to speak. But more than that, they were learning each other. She discovered the dry wit that lay beneath his stoic exterior, the sharp intelligence that was beginning to piece his world back together. He began to see the strength and resilience beneath her quiet gentleness, the stubborn determination that had kept her by his side. One night, a full moon hung in the sky, flooding the valley with silver light. The camp was quiet, the main bonfire having burned down to a bed of glowing coals. Inside their lodge, the small fire crackled, casting a warm, intimate glow. Cale had been sitting up on his own for nearly an hour, his back against a willow rest, his strength returning with each passing day. He had been quiet for a long time, watching her as she mended a tear in one of his shirts, her head bent over her work, her face illuminated by the firelight. "You are not afraid of me?" he asked, his voice low and clear. The question startled her. She looked up, her needle poised in midair. His eyes were fixed on her, searching, vulnerable. She saw the conflict in them, the warrior who was a legend to his people, the man who was a threat to hers, and the patient who was utterly dependent on her care. He was asking if she feared the legend or the man. Elena put down her sewing, her heart beating a little faster. She considered her answer carefully, wanting to give him the truth. Was she afraid she had been? At first, she had been terrified of this marriage, of this strange land, of the silent man in the bed. But now, "No," she said softly, her voice steady. She met his gaze without wavering. "I am not afraid of you, Cale." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I am only afraid you will fall back asleep and never return." The honesty of her answer hung in the air between them, simple and profound. It was a confession of her deepest fear, an admission that his presence, this difficult, complicated, waking presence, had become essential to her. The tension in his shoulders seemed to dissolve, the guarded look in his eyes softened, replaced by something warm and unguarded. A low chuckle escaped his lips. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. The sound was a little rusty, but it was rich and real, and it filled the small lodge with a warmth the fire could not match. And then, to her complete surprise, Elena found herself laughing too. It was a quiet laugh, a release of weeks of tension and fear and uncertainty. They sat there for a moment, smiling at each other in the flickering light, the sound of their shared laughter echoing in the intimate space. For the first time, there was no barrier between them. She was not the white wife, and he was not the sleeping warrior. They were not symbols of a peace treaty or figures in a tribal miracle. They were just a man and a woman, sitting by a fire, having found a common language not of words, but of shared vulnerability and a nascent, undeniable affection. The two worlds had finally met, not in a treaty or a ceremony, but in a simple, heartfelt laugh in the quiet of the night. The quiet intimacy that had grown within the lodge could not be contained by its hide walls, like smoke from a fire. The story of Cale Blackhawk's return to the world of the living drifted out of the valley. It was carried first by a young warrior sent to watch the borders, then by a prospector panning for color in a nearby stream, and finally, it rode into Dust Creek on the back of a supply wagon, where it exploded like a dropped crate of dynamite. At first, The town reacted with stunned disbelief, followed by a wave of jubilant relief. It was a miracle, a sign that God had not abandoned them to the desolation of the frontier. Jedediah Moore found himself slapped on the back, his daughter's name spoken with a reverence that bordered on worship. Elena was the blessed one, the woman who had done the impossible. The fragile peace, which had seemed ready to snap, now felt as if it had been forged anew in the smithy of some divine power. But in the West, miracles, like water, were a scarce and often suspect commodity. As the initial shock wore off, a different current of thought began to flow through the town, a dark undercurrent fed by old fears and new ambitions. A living Cale Blackhawk was a far more complicated reality than a dying one. A sleeping hero was a monument to a past debt. A waking one was a present power. A leader who could unite the Apache tribes. A warrior who remembered every treaty broken, every acre of land stolen. The loudest voice in this growing chorus of unease belonged to Silas Thorne, a rancher whose vast holdings pressed right up against the Apache territory. Thorne was a man who saw the world in terms of fences and ownership, and he had long considered the Apache an inconvenient obstacle to his expansion. He began to speak in the saloon, his voice a low, reasonable poison that dripped into the ears of anxious men. He spoke of concern for the blacksmith's daughter. "She is a white woman, a Christian woman," he would say, swirling the amber whiskey in his glass. "Living out there with them, we sent her as a gesture of peace, not as a permanent captive. Now that the man is awake, what is her purpose? It is our duty to bring her home, to rescue her." The word rescue caught on. It gave a noble sheen to their fear. Soon, men who had praised Elena's name were now muttering it with pity. She was no longer a miracle worker. She was a prisoner. Her father felt the shift more keenly than anyone. A delegation led by Thorne came to the smithy, their faces grim with manufactured concern. They demanded he go to the camp and retrieve his daughter. The peace treaty was fulfilled. They argued. It was time for Elena to be returned to her own kind. Jedediah, torn between his pride and his daughter's strange success and the immense pressure of the community, sent a message. It arrived with a trader who smelled of bacon grease and greed, a man who gave Elena a pitying look as he handed her the folded piece of paper. Her father's words were a painful blend of love and command. He wrote of the town's worries, of his own fears for her safety. He urged her to come home. Elena read the letter with a growing sense of dread. She was being pulled apart, claimed by two worlds that refused to understand each other, or her. The Apache now treated her with a delicate, suffocating reverence. The women would fall silent when she approached, their eyes filled with an awe that was as isolating as their previous scorn. They called her the woman who calls spirits, and they watched her every move as if she might vanish back into the spirit world she had touched. Singing Bird had warned her, her words a quiet command. "You are the heart of the hawk now. If the heart is removed, the body dies." They would not let her go. She was trapped, not in a cage of hide and poles, but in a cage of perception. To the Apache, she was a sacred talisman. To the whites, she was a damsel in need of rescue. Neither saw the woman who was slowly, tentatively, falling in love with the man she had awakened. Her relationship with Cale had deepened into a quiet rhythm of shared discovery. His strength was returning, the lean hardness of a warrior replacing the frailness of a patient. They spent their evenings by the fire, their clumsy lessons in language giving way to the sharing of stories. He told her of his youth, of learning to hunt, of his white father he had barely known. She told him of her mother, of the smell of hot steel in her father's smithy, of her foolish dreams of a world with more trees than sand. He was a man of profound stillness, but she was learning to read the landscape of his face, the humor that flickered in his eyes, the deep well of sorrow that lay behind his calm exterior. He, in turn, seemed to understand the restless spirit that churned beneath her composed surface. He saw the blacksmith's daughter in her capable hands, and the dreamer in her far-off gaze. The world outside their small lodge, however, was growing more dangerous. Scouts reported riders near the borders of their territory, men who watched the camp from the mesas, their rifles glinting in the sun. The tension in the camp was a palpable thing, a low thrum of anxiety that replaced the celebratory mood of Cale's return. The attack came on a night when the moon was new and the darkness was absolute. Elena and Cale had been sitting outside, watching the star-dusted sky. He had been tracing the constellations with his finger, giving her their Apache names, his voice a low murmur in the cool night air. A fragile peace had settled over her, a feeling that perhaps, in this small space between two worlds, she could build a life. It was a peace that was destined to be shattered. The first sign of trouble was the frantic barking of the camp dogs, followed by a chorus of panicked whinnies from the horse herd. Then came the screams. A wave of riders descended on the sleeping camp, their faces obscured by dust and darkness. They were not soldiers, they were raiders, Thorne's men. Their whoops and hollers fueled by whiskey and hate. Torches arced through the air, landing on the dry hides of the lodges, which erupted in flame. Chaos was instantaneous and absolute. Men, women, and children spilled from their burning homes, their shapes silhouetted against the growing inferno. The night air, once cool and clean, was now choked with thick, acrid smoke. The sharp crack of rifles echoed through the valley. Cale was on his feet in an instant, the patient forgotten, the warrior reborn. He shoved Elena behind him, his body a shield. "Stay in the lodge," he commanded, grabbing the hunting rifle that leaned against the doorframe. But it was too late. A torch landed squarely on their roof, and the hide began to smolder, then burn. They were forced out into the maelstrom. The world was a hellish vision of orange flame and shifting shadows. A rider galloped past, his face a demonic mask in the firelight, and swung a club at a fleeing woman. Cale raised his rifle and fired, the man tumbling from his saddle. But there were too many. He shoved Elena toward the relative safety of a cluster of large rocks near the creek bed. "Go!" he yelled over the din. As she scrambled for cover, she saw a man step from the shadows, his face illuminated by a burning lodge. It was Silas Thorne, a pistol in his hand. He was not aiming at the Apache warriors fighting in the distance. He was aiming directly at her. "The captive returns with me!" Thorne shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Cale moved faster than she could have imagined. He threw himself in front of her, shoving her hard toward the rocks. The world spun, and Elena fell, the hard ground knocking the wind from her. At the same moment, Thorne's pistol fired. The sound was deafeningly close. Cale grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and stumbled, his rifle clattering to the ground. He clutched at his shoulder, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his buckskin shirt. Thorne took a step forward, raising his pistol again, a triumphant sneer on his face. He was going to finish him. He was going to kill the man who had become the center of her world, the man she had pulled back from death's door. Something inside Elena snapped. The blacksmith's daughter, who had been taught to be dutiful, to be quiet, to endure, vanished, burned away by the fires of that terrible night. In her place was something new, something forged in rage and a love she could no longer deny. Her eyes fell on the rifle Cale had dropped. Without a second of hesitation, she lunged for it. The weapon was heavy, unfamiliar in her hands. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she had watched her father lift a 20-pound sledgehammer, had learned the physics of force and impact. She scrambled to her knees, raised the heavy barrel, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, a brutal, bruising force that knocked her backward. The explosion was a deafening roar in her ears. She did not know if she had hit anything. She had only aimed at the space where the threat was, but through the ringing in her ears and the smoke, she saw Thorne stumble back, his face a mask of shock, before disappearing into the swirling chaos. The raid was broken moments later, the remaining attackers melting back into the darkness from which they came. driven off by the fierce defense of the Apache warriors. But Elena did not see them go. She only had eyes for Cale, who was leaning against the rocks, his face pale in the firelight. She crawled to his side, the rifle still clutched in her hands. The camp was a ruin of fire and smoke behind them. The ground was littered with the casualties of the brief, brutal fight. She knelt beside him in the dirt, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. His blood, dark and warm, seeped through his shirt and dripped from his fingers onto the pale, sandy earth. The blood and the sand mixed, creating a dark, terrible paste, the symbol of a sacrifice made and anew. Violent beginning. She had fought to save the man she once feared, and in the ashes of their home, she finally knew, without a doubt, where she belonged. The immediate aftermath of the raid was a landscape of hell. The night was lit by the dying fires of what, hours before, had been homes. The air was thick with the stench of burned hide and the metallic tang of blood. The wounded were tended to where they lay, their groans a mournful chorus against the backdrop of weeping women and the grim, angry muttering of the warriors who had survived. Elena felt none of it. Her entire world had contracted to the space of earth she occupied beside Cale. She tore a strip of cloth from her own petticoat, her hands moving with a desperate, clumsy urgency, and pressed the makeshift bandage against the wound in his shoulder. His blood was hot and slick against her fingers, a shocking, intimate reality. He was conscious, but his eyes were glazed with pain, his breathing shallow and labored. Singing Bird appeared at her side like a spirit conjured from the smoke, her face a mask of grim determination. She knelt, her ancient, practiced hands assessing the damage with a swiftness that belied her age. She looked at Elena, at her wild eyes and blood-soaked hands, and then at the rifle lying in the dirt beside her. A flicker of something profound and new passed through the old woman's eyes. It was not the awe she had shown the spirit caller, but a deep, hard-earned respect for the warrior. "We must move him," Singing Bird said, her voice a low command. They carried him to a lodge at the edge of the camp that had been spared the worst of the flames. It was small, belonging to a young family that now huddled with relatives. They laid him on a bed of furs, and the grim work began. Singing Bird, with Elena as her silent, trembling apprentice, cleaned the wound. The bullet had passed clean through, a small mercy in a night of brutality, but it had torn through muscle, and the loss of blood had been severe. As the old healer stitched the wound with a sinew thread and a bone needle, Cale's body went rigid with pain, and then, mercifully, he slipped into unconsciousness. It was a different kind of stillness than before. This was not the deep, placid sleep of a spirit wandering between worlds. This was the heavy, unnatural slumber of a body grievously wounded, a body teetering on the precipice of death, and as the long night bled into a gray, smoke-choked dawn, Elena began her second vigil. This time everything was different. Before, she had been the reluctant warden of a stranger's body, her days a monotonous cycle of duty and her nights a lonely torment. Her fear then had been for her own lost future, for a life wasted in silence. Now, that fear was a pale ghost compared to the all-consuming terror that gripped her heart. Every shallow breath he took was a victory. Every long pause between those breaths was an eternity of dread. She was no longer watching a man sleep. She was fighting to keep a man from dying. The roles were now completely reversed. It was she who sat in the dim light of a fire, watching, waiting, praying for a sign of consciousness. It was she who leaned in close, her ear next to his lips, desperate to feel the whisper of his breath. The profound irony was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. She had brought him back from the silent land once, only to have the waking world try to steal him away again, more violently this time. And now she feared, with an agony that was a physical pain in her chest, that he would retreat once more into that deep, quiet place. And this time, he would not return. The thought of losing him to that eternal sleep was an unbearable weight. Days blurred into a nightmare of fever. The infection that Singing Bird had feared took hold, and Cale's body burned with an inner fire. He was no longer still. He thrashed in his delirium, his strong limbs moving with a restless energy that took all of Elena's strength to contain. He muttered in the Apache tongue, his words fragmented and sharp, the broken echoes of battles and hunts. Sometimes he would cry out a name, a word she did not understand, his face contorted in a memory she could not access. During these long hours, Elena did not leave his side. She was his anchor to the waking world, a constant, cooling presence against his feverish skin. She bathed his face with cloths dipped in cool water, her own body aching with fatigue. She forced spoonfuls of thin, herbal broth between his cracked lips, crooning to him in a low, steady voice, the same way she had when he was in his long sleep. But her words were different now. They were not the detached stories of a girl filling a lonely silence. They were desperate, personal pleas. "Do not leave me, Cale," she would whisper, her voice raw with exhaustion and fear. "You cannot go back there. I am here. Stay here with me. Please, stay." She talked to him constantly, telling him of the camp slowly rising from its own ashes, of the warriors rebuilding the burned lodges, of the children who had started to play again near the creek. She told him of her father, the blacksmith, and how she missed the smell of the forge. She talked until her throat was sore, her voice a constant thread she was trying to weave between his fevered mind and the reality of the lodge. Singing Bird came and went, bringing fresh poultices and assessing his state with her wise, sad eyes. The other women of the tribe, who had once held Elena at a distance, now approached the lodge with quiet offerings of food and water for her. They would look at her, her face pale with exhaustion, her dress stained with sweat and blood, and they would nod, a silent acknowledgement of her devotion. She had fired a rifle in their defense. She was tending their hero. She was no longer the outsider. She was one of them now, bound not by a treaty, but by the shared crucible of loss and survival. On the fourth night, the fever reached its crisis. Cale's breathing became a series of harsh, shallow gasps. His skin was slick with a sweat that offered no relief from the heat that consumed him. Elena knelt beside him, her own tears falling onto his burning face. She had done everything she could. There was nothing left but to wait for the fever to break, or for his heart to give out. She took his hand, his large, strong hand that now felt so fragile in hers, and she held on as if she could physically prevent his spirit from leaving his body. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour before the dawn, a change occurred. The violent shivering that had racked his body ceased. The harsh, gasping breaths began to even out, deepening into a slow, steady rhythm. The fire in his skin began to cool. The fever had broken. He fell into a deep, natural sleep, the first true rest his body had known since the attack. Elena watched him, her heart a wild mix of hope and lingering terror. This was the sleep of healing, but it looked so much like the sleep that had held him captive for so long. She stayed awake, her eyes burning with fatigue, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest as the first pale fingers of dawn crept into the lodge. He woke as the sun cleared the mountains, bathing the interior of the lodge in a soft, golden light. It was not a sudden awakening. His eyelids flickered, then slowly, he opened his eyes. They were no longer clouded with fever or confusion. They were clear, lucid, and they found her immediately. He looked at her, truly looked at her, taking in her disheveled hair, the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, the dried tear tracks on her cheeks. He saw not a spirit caller or a miracle worker, but a woman who had been to the edge of despair and back for his sake. A faint smile touched his lips, a smile of infinite tenderness and relief. He tried to speak, his voice a dry, weak whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, his words soft but clear in the quiet of the new morning. "I heard you calling me," he said, his gaze holding hers. a universe of meaning passing between them. And this time, I came back for you. The words were a perfect, mirrored echo of another awakening, in another time that felt like a lifetime ago. But this time, the meaning was profoundly different. He had not returned for a disembodied voice in the darkness, a mysterious tether to life. He had returned for her, for Elena. It was not fate or duty or medicine that had called him back. It was love. And as the morning sun filled the lodge, Elena finally let the tears of relief, of joy, of an all-consuming love fall freely. He was back. He had chosen to come back. And this time, he was home. In the weeks that followed, Cale's healing was a testament to the resilience of his body and the unwavering constancy of Elena's care. He began to walk the camp, his gait growing steadier each day, the wound in his shoulder healing into a puckered, angry scar. He was a symbol of their survival, a living embodiment of their will to endure. But with his returning strength, the political landscape, both inside the camp and out, began to shift and fracture. The quiet peace of the sick room was replaced by the loud, insistent demands of a world torn by hatred and fear. The Apache Council convened on a day when the sky was a hard, cloudless blue. The elders, their face etched with the grief of their losses and a simmering, righteous anger, asked Cale to meet them in the center of the rebuilding camp. Elena stood by his side, no longer an outsider but a recognized partner in his life. Her presence unquestioned, the chief, a man whose wisdom was now tinged with a deep weariness, spoke first. "The peace with the white man is a lie," he said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. "It was a rope woven of dust, and it has blown away in the first wind. They came into our homes as cowards in the night. They hurt our women and children. They tried to kill you, our protector. The young men's hearts are hot. They cry for vengeance. They need a leader to guide their anger. A war chief who knows the white man's ways and can turn their tactics against them. They need you, Cale Blackhawk. It is your duty. Lead us. We will wash the sand clean with the blood of Silas Thorne and his men." The words hung in the dry air. A promise of violence. A call to a war that felt both just and terrifying. The warriors gathered around the circle let out a deep, guttural cry of approval. They looked at Cale with fierce, expectant eyes. He was their hero, their returned leader. They saw the path forward as a straight, red line of retribution, and they wanted him to lead the charge. Elena's heart grew cold. She looked at Cale, at the hard line of his jaw, the familiar warrior's stillness settling over his features. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the deep pull of loyalty to the people who had raised him, the burning desire to avenge the attack on their home, on him, on her. For a moment, she feared she would lose him not to death or sleep, but to the all-consuming fire of a righteous war. Before Cale could answer, another figure appeared at the edge of the camp. It was a lone rider, a nervous-looking young man from a neutral settlement miles to the south, leading a pack mule. He carried a message, not from Silas Thorne, but from her father. The young man refused to come fully into the camp, his eyes wide with the fear that had poisoned the entire territory. He handed the letter to Elena and scurried away as if the very ground were cursed. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. Her father's script was a frantic scrawl, the words bleeding into one another with his haste and fear. He told her of the story Thorne was telling in Dust Creek, a twisted narrative of a savage Apache raid on his ranch, a story in which Elena was a tragic captive whose honor he had been trying to save. The town was an armed camp, gripped by a fever of paranoia. Men walked the streets with rifles, and the territorial rangers had been sent for. Her father begged her to leave, to run, to find a place of safety. He told her he loved her, and that he feared he would never see her again. His letter was not a demand for her return. It was the terrified plea of a father who believed his daughter was standing on the brink of a war that would consume them all. That night, when the camp was asleep, their dreams filled with ghosts and plans for vengeance, Elena and Cale walked to the top of the low mesa that overlooked the valley. Below them, the campfires of the Apache flickered like a small constellation of fallen stars. To the east, in the far distance, a few faint lights marked the location of Dust Creek. They were standing on the physical border between two worlds and on the precipice of an impossible choice. "My people see only one path," Cale said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. He did not have to explain. She had seen it in the warrior's eyes. "My blood calls for it. The part of me that is a warrior wants to make Thorn pay for the fear in your eyes that night." And what would be left after, she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper against the vast silence of the desert. "More widows, more orphans, my father, and others like him who are not filled with hate. They would be caught in the middle. Your war would burn down the good along with the bad." "And if I do nothing," he countered, the frustration raw in his voice. "Thorn will not stop. He sees this land, my people, as a blight to be removed. He will use the fear he has created to bring the soldiers, to rescue you. Doing nothing is a different kind of death." He was right. They were trapped between a path of bloody vengeance and one of passive annihilation. Both led to the same desolate end. Elena looked from the campfires to the distant lights of the town. She thought of her father's forge, the way he could take two separate pieces of stubborn, unyielding iron and, with fire and force and wisdom, join them into a single, stronger whole. "Then we must find a third path," she said, the idea taking shape in her mind even as she spoke the words. "Not their path of war, or their path of surrender. Our path." Cale turned to her, a question in his eyes. "We cannot unmake the hate in men's hearts," she continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a desperate, beautiful hope. "But we can build something that stands against it. Not a fortress for war, but a place for peace. Here, in the middle, on the land that belongs to no one and everyone, we can build a home, a trading post, a place where an Apache can trade a hide for a sack of flour without a rifle being pointed at his chest. A place where a white man can come for help from Singing Bird's medicines without fear. A place where people are just people, not enemies." It was a mad, impossible dream, a tiny candle of an idea against a hurricane of hatred. But Cale, the man of two bloods, the man who had lived his whole life on the border between worlds, did not laugh. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes. The blacksmith's daughter who saw a problem not as an end, but as a thing to be reshaped. He saw the truth in her wild hope. To lead his people in a war would be easy. To lead them in building a lasting peace, that was the true work of a chief. "A third path," he repeated softly, the words tasting of possibility. He looked out at the vast, empty land between the two settlements. It would be a life of hardship, of constant vigilance, of trying to build trust where there was only suspicion. It would be the hardest thing either of them had ever done. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "Our path." He agreed. They were married again at the first light of dawn. There was no priest, no shaman, no crowd of witnesses. They stood on that same mesa, with only Singing Bird and the rising sun as their witnesses. Cale had shed the warrior's paint, and the weight of his people's expectations. Elena had shed the last vestiges of the frightened girl who had been traded for peace. They stood before each other as equals, their choices entirely their own. He had carved a small hawk from a piece of ironwood, its wings outstretched, and placed it on a leather cord around her neck. She had taken the tarnished copper ring, the symbol of her old, coerced duty, from her finger. In its place, she tied a simple, braided cord of leather around his wrist, a knot of her own making, strong and true. She looked into his eyes, clear and calm in the morning light, and she spoke the words that had been forming in her heart. "The first time," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet air, "I became the wife of a man who could not wake. I was bound by duty, and I was afraid." She paused, her hand rising to touch the carved hawk at her throat. "This time, I stand here by choice. I am the wife of the man who chose me when he was awake." A slow smile spread across Cale's face, a smile that reached his eyes and filled them with a light that rivaled the dawn. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. "And I," he said, his voice deep and sure, "am the husband of the woman who called me home, not once, but twice. I choose this path. I choose this life, with you." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that held no desperation or fear, only the simple, profound truth of a love that had been forged in silence and tempered in fire. As they stood together on the edge of their two worlds, the sun rose higher, flooding the desert with a clean, golden light, illuminating the new, untrodden path that lay before them. It was a path they would walk together. 5 years had passed. The scar on Cale's shoulder had faded to a silvery line, and the ashes of the raid had long since been scattered by the desert winds. In their place, something new had taken root. On the stretch of borderland that had once been a contested no-man's land, there now stood a testament to a mad, impossible dream. They called it Hawk's Crossing. It was not a town, not yet. It was a single, sturdy building made of adobe brick and sun-bleached timber, a trading post with a wide, welcoming porch, a deep well, dug with the combined effort of Apache warriors and a grudgingly hired crew from a town to the south, offered clean water to any who passed. Behind the post stood a small, solid home and a corral where the horses of travelers could rest. It was a place built of sweat and stubborn hope, an island of pragmatic peace in a vast ocean of mistrust. From the porch of their home, Elena watched the evening settle over the land. The brutal heat of the day was surrendering to a cool, purple dusk. A few lanterns had been lit inside the post, casting warm squares of light into the growing darkness. She saw an old prospector sharing a pipe with one of Cale's cousins, their conversation a low, easy murmur of English and Apache, each man understanding just enough of the other's tongue to get by. Near the well, a small girl with her mother's gray eyes and her father's jet-black hair chased a lizard into the sagebrush, her laughter a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. This was the life they had built. It was not easy. There were days when the old hatreds flared up, when a rider from Dust Creek would spit on the ground, or a young Apache warrior would look at a white traveler with undisguised contempt. Silas Thorne still ran his ranch, though his influence had waned, his narrative of hate finding less purchase in a land where people were beginning to value fair trade over old fears. And her father, Jedediah, now made the journey from Dust Creek twice a year, his wagon filled with metal tools to trade. He would never fully understand the world his daughter had chosen, but he saw that she was not a captive, and he saw in his granddaughter's face a future he had never imagined. He had even, on his last visit, shared a cup of coffee in silence with Cale, a small, seismic shift in the landscape of their lives. Elena opened the leather-bound journal that rested in her lap. The pages were filled with her elegant script, a record of inventories, of seasons, of a life taking shape. But tonight, she turned to a fresh page, her mind not on the sacks of flour or bolts of cloth, but on the long, winding path that had led her here. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, the faint scratching sound a quiet counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. She wrote of the girl she had once been, a blacksmith's daughter who felt her life was a piece of iron to be hammered into a shape of someone else's choosing. She wrote of the tarnished copper ring, of the crushing weight of duty, of the terror of a future she had not asked for. I once thought my life was a story being written for me, a tale of sacrifice penned by fate and circumstance. I was to be the wife of a ghost, a silent price paid for a brittle peace. I believed I was trapped, a pawn in a game played by men and their codes of honor. My world was small, defined by the walls of my father's smithy and the dust of a town that saw me as a daughter, then a bargain, then a captive. I believed I had no choice. But fate, I have come to learn, is not a river that carries us along. It is the earth beneath our feet, and it is our own steps that carve the path. My journey did not begin when my father forced a ring upon my finger. It began when I chose to speak into a profound silence. It began with a simple human impulse, a feeling of compassion for a man I did not know, a man lost in a darkness I could not comprehend. That kiss, the moment the tribe still whispers of as a great magic, was not magic at all. It was the first choice I truly made for myself. It was an act not of duty, but of empathy. And it taught me the greatest lesson of my life. Love is not a miraculous spell that awakens the sleeping. Love is the courage to sit in the darkness with another. It is the choice to offer your own small light, your own voice, your own warmth, without any promise that it will be received. Cale was not saved by a miracle. He was saved by his own ferocious will to live, a will that I was simply privileged to witness. And in turn, I was not saved by a hero. I was saved by the choice to pick up a rifle to defend the life we had begun to build. I was saved by the decision to turn my back on the two warring paths of vengeance and surrender, and to forge a third way, a path of our own making. She paused, her gaze drifting to the trading post, to the peaceful, mingled light that spilled from its windows. People are not bound by their blood, or by the feuds of their fathers. We are only bound by the choices we make. We can choose to build walls, or we can choose to dig a well where all may drink. We can choose to see each other as enemies, or we can choose to see the humanity that flickers in every soul. Our life here at Hawks Crossing is a hard one, and it is a fragile one. But every day that a child of two bloods laughs in the dust, every time two old enemies share a pipe on my porch, it is a testament to the power of a humane choice. I once thought I was defined by fate, but I see now that it was I who awakened that fate. With a whisper, with a kiss, with a choice, with a steadfast and stubborn love. She closed the journal as she heard the soft tread of his moccasins on the porch steps. Cale came and stood behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. He did not ask what she was writing. He did not need to. He had lived every word of it with her. The quiet companionship between them was a language deeper than words, a peace earned through fire and fear. "The sun is rising," he said softly, his breath warm against her hair. She nodded, rising from her chair. He took her hand, and they walked to the corral where their horses waited, already saddled. They mounted in the seamless, fluid motion of long practice and rode out from the small sanctuary they had built. They did not ride east toward the settled lands of the white men, nor west into the heart of the Apache territory. They rode south, along the invisible line that had once divided their worlds. The dawn broke across the desert, a spectacular, silent explosion of color. The sky turned from deep indigo to soft rose, then to a brilliant, burning gold. The first rays of the sun struck the tops of the mesas, setting the red sand aglow, as if the earth itself were lit from within. They rode side by side, their horses moving as one, their shadows long behind them. They were two people, born of enemy worlds, who had refused to be enemies. They were a man and a woman who had found each other in the space between silence and a scream, between duty and desire, between life and death. As they rode along the border, they had transformed from a barrier into a bridge. Two separate souls moving as one. They were the living legacy of the light they had chosen to create, a quiet, enduring promise of a new day. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the West. Please let us know where in the world you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.